We got our first sheep in 2006, and we really chose them because we had a terrible weed problem and we wanted to find something that would do well on weeds. And we read that hair sheep are as close to goats as you can get in terms of their forage preferences.
In this episode of Voices from the Field, Margo Hale, NCAT'S Southeast Regional Director, and Tracy Mumma, an NCAT Agriculture Specialist, discuss considerations in raising hair sheep. The discussion is based on their own experiences in two very different climates. In Tracy's case, in Montana, and in Arkansas for Margo. Because they aren't as well known as wool sheep, Tracy and Margo begin by explaining what hair sheep are, and then go on to discuss some of the benefits of hair sheep and some potential pitfalls to be aware of when deciding whether a hair sheep enterprise is right for your farm. Let's listen.
Hi, I'm Margo Hale, NCAT'S Southeast Regional Director and Livestock Specialist. And today I am thrilled to be visiting with Tracy Mumma, NCAT Agriculture Specialist out of our Montana office. And Tracy and I, we've worked together for many years and are both members of our NCAT livestock team. And we recently were talking about, all of the materials that we've developed here at NCAT and ATTRA over the years. And, there's nothing specific about raising hair sheep. So that's what we're going to talk to you about today. And I'm just thrilled to have Tracy join me. So Tracy, why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself quickly for our listeners?
Thanks, Margo. I'm happy to be here too. I am a farmer in Montana. We have a small diversified livestock farm where we raise pastured sheep and cows and chickens and one goat and one dairy cow and a little bit of everything. And sheep were our first enterprise, and they are our main enterprise, and we raise Katahdin hair sheep. We got our first sheep in 2006. And we really chose them because we had a terrible weed problem and we wanted to find something that would do well on weeds. And we read that hair sheep are as close to goats as you can get in terms of their forage preferences. And that was what we wanted to go for. So we bought 6 sheep and a ram, and that was the start of our flock, which today is around 70 ewes and 3 or 4 rams. So it's grown over the years quite a bit, and it's been a good enterprise for us.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll just add a little bit of my experience with hair sheep. My husband and I, we too, like you, Tracy, have diversified a little bit of everything, cattle, but goats are our primary enterprise. And over the years, we have had hair sheep, a small flock of hair sheep at times. We don't have hair sheep anymore. And later on in our discussion, I'll talk about some of the reasons why we don't have hair sheep. But I have a little bit of experience. So Tracy, as you share your experience, I'll probably interject a few thoughts or my experiences, especially because we raise hair sheep or have raised hair sheep in very different environments. You in Montana and me here in Arkansas. So there are definitely some differences. And so we just want to share those experiences as well. So you mentioned a little bit about why you have hair sheep, but I'm always actually kind of surprised at how many people don't even know what hair sheep are or that they even exist, that it is such a thing. And so could you maybe just let our listeners know, if they're not familiar, what are hair sheep and, what are the differences between hair sheep and wool sheep? And, many of our NCAT co-workers have wool sheep. And so we've heard Dave Scott and Linda Coffey and Linda Poole talk about their sheep, which are all wool sheep, for many years. And so here's the chance to learn a little bit about learn about hair sheep.
Hair sheep actually have hair that falls off. You don't have to shear them. And though that might sound counterintuitive because you would say, oh, I want the wool, that's a big product, it actually can be really difficult to find a wool market and to find shearers, depending on where you're located in the country. Now, Montana has a lot of sheep, and shearers are not so much a problem for us, but it's hard to get shearers if you're a small operation with just a few sheep. And it can be hard to get scheduled in. It can be hard to get your wool to a market. And for us, we decided it would be easier to just have the hair sheep, which shed off naturally in the spring. Interestingly enough, some of them don't shed very well. They don't shed their whole coat. And some of them slick off all their hair and have a very short coat during the summer. And there are actually different types of hair classifications. For us, it doesn't matter so much. We don't care if they look sort of shaggy and are trailing some pants behind them or something if they shed off part way, because we raise them primarily for their meat and for their land management capability. Hair sheep do shed off. There are several different varieties of hair sheep. Some of the most popular ones are the Katahdin, which is what we have, the St. Croix, which was a progenitor of the Katahdin. They were in their back lineage. Barbados blackbelly sheep are another hair sheep, and Dorper sheep are another one that's pretty common. There are several more, 4 or 5 really random breeds, but those 4 are the main hair sheep breeds.
Yeah, when we raised hair sheep, we had primarily Katahdins, though sometimes there would be a Dorper cross or a Barbados blackbelly in there as well. So, but Katahdins are, I think, probably, the most widely known hair sheep breed.
And to be honest, we selected them also because Katahdins always look like they're smiling. They have a particular look to their face that makes them happy looking sheep. And that's important.
It is. I never thought about that, but you're right. They do look happy. Hey, we have to enjoy our animals, right? If we're going to have them, that's one of my things. If we're going to have them, let's enjoy them.
And one of the benefits of hair sheep that I haven't really talked about yet is the taste of their meat. Barbados have been in taste tests determined to be the tastiest of sheep. They've won hands down in taste tests. Hair sheep have a milder taste because the lanolin in their wool does not affect the flavor of their meat because they don't have wool. And for us, that's been a benefit because it means that you can keep eating the sheep past the age when they're traditionally considered lamb. And even as an adult, the meat is palatable and good tasting. So that's a big reason for hair sheep for us as far as marketing the meat.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So, you talked about kind of why you got into hair sheep. You had weeds and you needed to manage that. And so that was, the reason you first looked at integrating hair sheep into your farm. And I just want to take a moment here. Anytime we talk about new livestock enterprises, I think it's really important for producers to really consider their farm goals and how any enterprise might help them with their farm goals or meet the goals that they have for their farm. So, you identified an issue you were having on your farm and said, hey, it looks like hair sheep, or it looks like, sheep would be a good option, but hair sheep probably a better option because some of those advantages that you just discussed. So I'm going to share this because it leads into kind of our conclusion. For my husband and I, we had always had goats and we really like goats. My husband grew up raising goats. And so that's what we know and what we're familiar with. And, for us adding sheep, we too looked at the forage management. We got cows, we have goats, sheep will eat those weeds. And so, for us, it looked like it was a good enterprise for us as well. Over the years, we realized that it was just one too many enterprises for us. And so that's one of the reasons we, moved away from the sheep enterprise. But I think being really clear about how these animals are going to help us meet our farm goals. And so I would love to hear, Tracy, how your hair sheep have helped you meet your farm goals.
We've used the hair sheep in rotational grazing around our pastures, and we've been able to really improve the condition of our pastures by doing that, by staying on top of that management. Now, we found that sheep don't trample the forage as much, which is one of the goals of pasture management. And we found we had difficulty with that. So what we did was use electric fence to group them up in a very tight grouping. and we rotate them quite a lot. We rotate them every day to get them onto new grass and to keep them grouped up in a bunch. And that works well for us. It's been a very good result for our pasture. And I guess one of the things that I wanted to mention about the sheep is that we chose them because they're small and easy to handle. And that was a benefit for our family. That fit in well with us because we really don't have the infrastructure or the facilities to handle cattle. And so sheep work better for us. Now, over time, we found that we needed a lot of sheep infrastructure as well. We did have to get a sorting chute and get equipment sized for sheep. So that is a consideration. Just because they're small doesn't mean they're infrastructure free. They need something.
So I'm just curious, you said you had a weed problem and you've integrated these hair sheep into your rotational grazing system. What have been the results of that? Have you, seen their forage preference really help you control your weeds?
It has really helped control weeds. I wouldn't say that we are weed free. I mean, it's an ongoing process, but definitely the pastures are in so much better condition in terms of, we've seen the grass species change and we've got more preferable species in. When we started, we had like nothing but Kentucky bluegrass and head-high thistle and burdock, and they've really helped us control the burdock, the broadleaf weeds. We still have a little bit of a thistle problem, but our pastures have an amazing diversity of grass now, just a really wide variety of grass species, and they have infilled and spread in the places where it was looking sort of bare when we bought the place.
Yeah, that's great. That's great to hear how they've helped improve your pastures. And in the meantime, not only are they helping you improve your pastures, but you have a product to sell. So win-win, right?
Right.
So you mentioned a few of the advantages of hair sheep, and I know there's a few more that we want to make sure we talk about, but can you talk about what kind of keepers? I know that's kind of maybe a livestock management term, if they're an easy keeper or not, but just kind of your experience in managing their behavior and lambing, all of those kind of things when we think about, okay, we got to add another livestock species and how is this going to affect how we manage our operation?
The Katahdins have been really good for us as far as managing on pasture. They do well out in the elements for us, even though it's Montana and we have snow and rain and wind and some nasty weather. Yeah. They do well on pasture. They lamb on pasture. We often bring them in to a paddock for lambing so we can keep an eye on them close to the house, but we leave them out on pasture till they lamb. And then sometimes we'll put them in a lambing jug to bond with their mother and to get some extra attention. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we leave them out on pasture and they do just fine. That is somewhat weather dependent. I'm not going to say you can always do that. And then as the lambs get a little older, we start rotating them in the electronet with the adults, and that works fine. They handle it well, and we wean them when they're about 5 months old. We sort out the male lambs, and we generally leave the females in with their moms and let them go until fall, until the breeding season. We sort out the breeding flocks on November 1st, and we lamb in April, when in Montana there is still a little chance of snow, and sometimes they get caught in the snow, and sometimes it's green grass and great lambing weather.
Yeah, so I know what you're doing this weekend, right? Sorting sheep. Well, you mentioned that they do really well in the elements of Montana and have adapted well, and even in snow. And I'll say the same for here in Arkansas, in the humid South, Katahdins and hair sheep in general are a popular enterprise because they do well in the hot, humid climate, and producers aren't worried about them being heat stressed with a heavy wool coat or things like that. So I know the advantage kind of sounds like on both ends of the spectrum. I feel my experience is they are hardy, and like you mentioned, they lamb on pasture with with relative ease. And of course, a lot of that is good management and selection over the years. I know you have, selected your ewes that are hardy and do well and produce in your system. And so that's a big part of it, because we know that there's going to be bad ones in any group, but our experience has been they've been real hardy and fairly easy keepers in most ways.
One thing, Margo, we should probably talk about is the color. Is if you're raising hair sheep, the color really doesn't matter, and so you can select for whatever you're looking for. In our case, we selected sheep with a black nose because they didn't sunburn their nose. And so instead of a pink nosed sheep, we looked for black nosed, and whether that, now we have an all black ram. And so we have a lot of dark brown lambs, and we also have spots and dots, and you can breed for some kind of fun coloration, which is a benefit too.
Yes, we always selected for those fun patterns. I love the speckles. We had a black ram for a while too. So I love the variation. You can get reds and real creamy colors, and black ones, and it's fun. And once again, it's good to enjoy what you're looking at, and having those happy little speckled sheep. I mean, goodness, there's not much cuter, right? One thing we haven't talked about is parasites and the parasite resistance of hair sheep breeds. And, if you've been around our ATTRA materials for any time, you know that we have a plethora of information on sheep and goat parasites. And we do talk about, the differences between breeds and then just genetic selection and selecting for animals that are more parasite resistant. But I'm curious to hear your experience and with your hair sheep and dealing with parasites, and what you've seen with your hair sheep.
We do have some parasite problems from time to time. We try to cull those problem individuals from the herd, and we've used a variety of, I guess I'll say, alternative wormers, ranging from garlic juice to black walnut leaves and walnut leaves to get them extra tannins. One thing we've noticed, though, is as the forage diversity has improved, our parasite problems have gone down. And I think that the sheep do a lot of self-medication of parasites by choosing their forage. So for us, that's not been a huge problem.
Yeah. Well, and I know that Katahdins, specifically, the breed as a whole has done a lot of tracking of the parasite resistance and, have breed values for their parasite resistance. So, as we mentioned earlier with the health, there's going to be good ones and bad ones within any breed, but Katahdins and other hair sheep in general tend to, do better with managing parasites. And Tracy, you are absolutely right. We have that all over our parasite information as, pasture quality and quantity and diversity improve. That helps our animals manage internal parasites. Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked there's a lot of good things about these hair sheep and a lot of reasons why you raise them and others raise them. But we know, as with any enterprise, there's going to be some downsides. So let's take a few minutes and just talk about some of the, disadvantages of hair sheep, or maybe some of the challenges that you've experienced in your years of raising hair sheep.
One thing that we see in hair sheep quite a bit, with the Katahdins in particular, is that they tend to breed down in size. If you're not watching your genetics really carefully and bringing in a bigger ram and an unrelated ram and watching that genetic situation carefully, you can end up with Katahdins that are maxing out at like 30 pounds. They get really small. And I cannot tell you how many times people have tried to sell us sheep, and we go to look at them and we're startled by how tiny they are, because if you're not watching that breeding, you end up with a really small sheep.
Mm-hmm. And for you, where you're selling meat, selling lamb, that is so important that you are paying attention to your carcass size and, having those genetics that are helping you produce that high quality meat product every time.
Right. And it is a key consideration. Katahdin in general are just smaller than something like the Suffolk or the Targhee or a typical market sheep that's a big sheep. And so when we're taking them in for processing and you're looking at a flat rate for the kill fee and a flat rate for the disposal fee, and you're getting a much higher cost per pound on your smaller animals than you do on a big meat sheep. And so though we think the quality of the meat is really good, we have to be really careful to not get to the point where it's way too expensive. That processing in particular is a challenge for us right now. There are no openings at the processor. Processors are not wanting to deal with sheep at all because they deem it too much work. And we've had in the past year a really difficult time finding processors. There are a few ways around this. I mean, one of the things we've done is resort to a lot of direct marketing, which is a challenge. It takes a lot of work to direct market a lot of sheep. And the market is thin. I mean, there's only a limited number of people who want to come to the farm and slaughter and butcher their own sheep.
Yeah. And, that option is not allowed in some places as well. But, finding a processor is such a challenge for small scale livestock producers in general, all across the country. The last 2 years of the COVID pandemic has accelerated that problem, at least in my experience and in talking with other livestock producers. That is just very challenging to even have access to a processor that's anywhere close to your farm, and then getting a spot. I mean, we're booking spots for our beef and hogs a year plus out, and that's just really challenging to manage. And as you said, the price, and that's always been our experience with goats or sheep, that the processors, the price that they charge to process those animals, it's like, they're not worth that amount of money. So it's definitely a challenge. And so, listeners, if you're thinking about getting into sheep production, lamb production, definitely, any livestock production, definitely consider the access to processing. And I do want to mention, and we can make sure and link this in our show notes, but our former coworker, Dave Scott and Linda Coffey, did a series of podcasts on direct marketing lamb, and they talked a lot about processing. And so I think Dave just shared, and his wife Jenny shared so much really good information and just their experience of direct marketing lamb for many years. So those are relevant. And if you're interested in selling lamb, definitely check those out as well. So you've done a lot of direct marketing. When you can get your animals into the processor, do you typically sell cuts? Are you selling, whole or half animals? How exactly? Tell a little bit more about how you are marketing your animals, maybe in an ideal situation.
Sure. We've marketed a lot of animals live as breeding stock because Katahdins have soared in popularity in recent years as people have realized that you don't have to shear them. They are great for people who need a few weed eaters in their yard and don't want to deal with the problems of shearing. They're great for people who are working stock dogs and need a few sheep for their dog to work and don't want to deal with shearing.
Yeah.
So, and then we've sold starter flocks to people who are getting into sheep production themselves. So the live sheep market has been important for us. We direct market whole sheep and half sheep. And then we sell at the farmer's market as well. We sell ground lamb, we sell cuts of lamb, and we sell value added lamb products, which has been good for us, like lamb summer sausage. And lamb ham is something we've done recently.
Oh, okay.
It helps to have a product that is not found everywhere. It helps to have a niche product, and it helps to promote that product and develop a name for yourself. You're kind of memorable if you're the only one selling that kind of product.
Yes, absolutely. That's really interesting to hear. Lamb ham. I haven't heard of that. So there you go, Tracy. You would have me. I would be your customer if I was close. And so, do you sell any of your sheep? Okay, say you have some sheep, and we know they're not all destined to go to someone's farm for breeding stock. Maybe they're not a fit for your meat, your direct market meat. What do you do with your lambs that maybe didn't grow out right or aren't a fit somewhere else?
Well, we have not ever sold them on the commodity market because Katahdins are so small and so relatively unrecognized in the commodity market that we've never just sent them off to auction. We've done a lot of alternative things, from turning them into dog food to just eating them ourselves.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, here in Arkansas, there are, I would have to look at the stats. I don't actually know for certain, but I am imagining there are way more hair sheep than wool sheep, at least in my area of what I see. Most of our producers, aren't raising wool sheep. There are some, including, Linda Coffee, who's, sitting in the office next to me. And I do have some neighbors that raise wool sheep, but most folks are raising hair sheep for all of those advantages that we've discussed, their ability to do well on pasture and their hardiness and their good, mild lamb flavor. And really the fact that you don't have to shear them, because here in Arkansas, there's very few shearers. You at least have many shearers in Montana, even if it's hard to get an appointment being a small farm. Here in our area, there's like one or two, that shear every sheep in the whole state. So that definitely is a challenge here. So I know a lot of people, go the hair sheep route to not have to deal with that issue. Before we kind of wrap things up here, I do want to share, Tracy's going to conclude with some really great thoughts about, why she has her hair sheep and how they've worked for them. And I just want to share my farm's story of why we don't still have hair sheep. And that was it was one too many enterprises. My husband and I were really used to cattle and goats. And for us, the small ruminants, we prefer the personality of goats. In our experience, our hair sheep were just harder to manage because of their personalities, because they're, flock animals. They are, a little more standoffish. They're not near as personable in our experience as our goats. And so whenever we did need to do something with our sheep, gather them in the corral or move them to a new area or whatever it may be, our sheep were always the problem. They were always the one who didn't do what we wanted to do. And so because we had goats and the hair sheep, and like you mentioned, like their forage preference is pretty close. It's not far off. And so for us, let's stick with goats. Some of our farm goals are to have enterprises that are easily managed, that, don't take a lot of extra time and definitely don't cause us stress. And the sheep always caused us stress because they were just a little harder for us to manage and to get them to do what we wanted them to do. Where, our goats are in your back pocket and are easy to move and handle anywhere that we wanted. So that's just, one farm's experience with hair sheep and why we no longer have hair sheep as an enterprise.
That's funny, Margo, because we're just sort of the opposite on that.
Yeah.
For us, cows are the difficult animal. We really can't handle the cows, and they're always out and they're always causing problems. And the sheep are something that we want to focus on, because with our young daughter, it's something she can be out there with us and we can handle them together, and we can do that as a family. And the sheep really seem, I'll say non-threatening. That doesn't mean that sheep are perfectly not dangerous, because they can be dangerous,
Yeah.
but for us, they're much more manageable, and the sheep work well in the electronet. They work well with our grazing system, whereas the goats are a constant challenge, always getting out. and so conversely, they work for us. They work for our enterprise.
Yeah, no. And I think that's the great thing about hearing different farmers' experiences and their perspectives, and why we always encourage people to go out and visit farms and get some hands-on experience with different types of enterprises, because you just have to figure out what works for you and works for your farm, and, you know, what your preferences are. You know, really our preference is just goats. And so we're going to make that work over another enterprise. So I think it's always really interesting to hear, you know, what works on one farm definitely doesn't work on another. So that's why it's so valuable to hear all of these experiences.
Absolutely. And that tracks all the way down to the market. What works in one market does not work in another. If you have an ethnic market nearby that loves goats, you're probably golden with goats. But if you have people who love sheep, then maybe you want to stick with sheep. And if you don't have people who like either of those, then you better be looking at something else.
Find something else.
Yeah.
Well, since you mentioned the market, I didn't ask this earlier, Tracy, but did you have to do any, you know, kind of education with your customers to get them interested in buying lamb? Or are your customers, you know, have they been used to purchasing and eating lamb, or have you kind of had to do that education?
We've had to do a lot of re-education with people who had awful lamb 40 years ago and never wanted to eat it again. So we really had to counteract that with people who've never tried it, or people who thought they didn't like it and who have become customers, especially with the value added products, because like one of our big sellers is lamb bratwurst, and that's easy for people to cook. For one thing, they don't have to learn a new recipe. They can just, you know, throw it on the grill. So that's been a really good gateway for us to introduce people to lamb as a product.
Ooh, that sounds delicious. Once again, Tracy, if I was close, I'd be your customer. Okay, so why don't you wrap things up for us, Tracy? Why don't you give us your overall take on hair sheep, and anything we didn't discuss that you think our listeners should know about? Any resources that have been particularly helpful for you, or some of our ATTRA resources that you think would be great for our listeners to check out?
Sure. ATTRA was probably what got me started in sheep in the first place. ATTRA resources were what first got us going in farming, in fact. So they've been our steady companion. And over the years, I've found a lot of benefit in the parasite resistance publications from ATTRA, in the pasture management publications, and in things like Linda Coffey's publication on the frequently asked questions on raising sheep. Many of those points apply across the board to hair sheep or wool sheep. And so those have been super resources for me in my time producing sheep. And sheep have just been, like I said, an enterprise that fits well for us. And we will be continuing with sheep on some level. I'm not sure we'll stay with as big of a flock as we have now, given the processing challenges that we're encountering. But sheep are something that we want to stick with because we're happy with the way they've treated our land, and our long-term goal is to improve the condition of the farm. And sheep are something that help us do that, and that we see ourselves being able to manage into the future.
That's wonderful, Tracy. You just put that so concisely, and, you know, thinking about our livestock and our, you know, other farming enterprises, and how they can help us improve our land and continue farming into the future. I mean, that's exactly what we want, right? And that's why we're here, and why you and I do this work and provide these educational resources so that other producers can do the same. So thank you so much for sharing your experience with hair sheep and letting us get a little glimpse into your farm. I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. So we will make sure and link all of those resources that Tracy mentioned. And you're absolutely right. We have some really good ATTRA resources related to raising small ruminants, sheep, goats, and yes, it applies to hair sheep as well. So we'll make sure and link those in the show notes. So thank you, Tracy.
Thank you, Margo.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at attra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATTRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT'S ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.